My name is Kindiriana Washington. I was born in Oklahoma. My mother had me when she was young. She was really active in the church when she was young as well, so Christianity was always a really big part of our lives. Yes, I know my father. He helped raise me he was active in raising me for the first 3 years of my life. And when we lived in Oklahoma. And around the time that I was 3 years old, my mother moved to Dallas for better opportunities. And I've been living here since I was around 3 years old, so basically most of my life. I'm 21 now, and I'm a student at the University of Texas at Dallas. I was really young. I don't remember much from Oklahoma. I was born in a small town. We lived in Tulsa, but I was born in Okmulgee. I was kind of a surprise all the way around.
What's the name?
The name of the town is Okmulgee.
Okmulgee.
Okmulgee. The population is very low. It's still very low. I think it's decreasing as time goes on. It's definitely a farm town. I've only been there a few times in my life. I went there to visit my great-grandmother. She lived there until she passed. So since then, it hasn't been the main meeting place for my family. But when we moved to Dallas, I went to school here. I've basically always gone to school here. And Christianity was a really big part of our lives. Since my mom was a single parent, she worked really hard and she sought refuge in the church. So we were always there, sometimes multiple times per week. And that's where I met all of my friends at that time. And when I was young, my relationship with Christianity was primarily emotional. I liked to go there. I liked the way it felt. It's where all of my social activities were. Well, when I was young, my mother was actually, she worked for FedEx. And that's hard work. It's long hours. But when we weren't there, our friends were basically in the church. So we were in the church on Wednesdays. We were there on Sundays. We were there on Tuesdays. If she wasn't working, we were basically there because we had a sort of small Southern Baptist background. So the church was kind of like our family. In the church, when I was young, I went to Sunday school and I attended Sunday services. My mom loved to sing, so she was always in the choir. The church had different activities that we could do throughout the summer and throughout the year. And as I said earlier, it was mainly emotional. There were no theological studies. And I think that as a Christian, it was all about connecting. It was all about feeling God and being with God and having a personal relationship with God in respect to the Trinity. Well, the structure is kind of similar to what happens in the masjid. We meet on Mondays instead of meeting on Fridays. There's praise and worship, which is basically in non-denominational and Protestant churches. And I was a Protestant Christian, and later I didn't have any denomination. So in some groups of Christianity, there is no singing or music, but there was music. That's sort of how it starts out. And then there's a lecture or a sermon, and after that there's a call to the altar where people can come up and accept Christianity if they like, if they're not Christian, or they can sort of renew their faith. On Wednesdays, there's sort of a midweek service where everyone comes into the church and there's a short lecture and a short worship period, and then we go home. And all other days of the week would be when organizations would meet. So there may be a Bible study with women or a Bible study for children, something like that. And they basically choose a verse from the Bible and everyone's able to study and analyze it. But the huge difference, I believe, in Bible study in the church and Bible study in Islam and at the masjid is that in the masjid, it's basically theological. You study the background, you apply it to your life, you talk about the hadith and what's written in the Quran and what maybe the different opinions are and what we should do in our lives, where Bible study in the church, for me and from my observations, it was mainly praying. We did study the verse and it was mainly about tugging at your heart and getting an understanding from your heart, not necessarily from an objective view. So that's why I think in Christianity, Christians are more, they like to feel, whereas Muslims, they want to understand a little bit more and get the background and think more objectively. When I was young, for most of my life, I was a single child. I spent a lot of time alone, so I definitely had time to kind of let my imagination come out, and I read lots of books. And around the time that I was 8 years old, my mother married, and the dynamic changed dramatically. I went from being a single child to having four other siblings, and I had always talked to my mom, and I always told her that, I would like a brother and sister. I would like to have someone to play with. And then, I got four all at once, and I sort of wanted to send them back. I didn't want them anymore. But I mean, I think it was a good experience. In a mixed family, there are definitely some challenges. At that time, I had four siblings, and my mother and my stepfather had two children on their own, so I had six siblings. And now that my biological family is married, I have 9 total. So I have 9 brothers and sisters, which is a pretty big number. And it makes for an interesting dynamic as a whole. There's definitely a lot going on. When I was growing up, actually, I'm not completely sure what groups probably wouldn't have any music. I know that some don't. The structure is different in different church. In Christianity, there's Catholic groups, and then there are Protestant groups. And I was Protestant. I wasn't really raised in the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church is much different than the Protestant Church. In the Protestant church, in most Protestant churches, there is a portion where there's music and there's singing, and that could range from a full multi-piece band to a choir alone. It really just depends on what that particular group is. I started out in a Baptist church, so that's really active. I think especially in African-American churches, predominantly African-American churches, which is what I was raised in when I was a child. Music and singing in the choir is a really big thing, and I think it always has been a big thing for the Black community. Historically, in the beginning, when my ancestors were first brought to this country, they sought refuge in religion. Of course, some of them were Muslim, most of them weren't, and all of them had to adopt Christianity and become Christian. It was sort of forced on them, but it's kind of the way they organized and they came together, because they were working from when sunrise to sunset, and then they would come together and they would have their own churches, and they would sing these songs that tell their story. There are these spirituals that talk about how I'm a slave now, but when I die and I go to see Jesus, because they're Christian, I'll finally be free. And a lot of these songs are still in churches today. It definitely it shows what they were going through, and something, I think for the Black community, the dynamic really changed during the civil rights era, because this whole time it had been all about the church and being involved in the church. And although things are tough here in America, and although we face discrimination and racism, some very disgusting racism, when we die, we'll finally be free and we'll finally be equal. But during the civil rights era, the Nation of Islam, it started to grow, and leaders like Malcolm X, they were teaching something totally different. They were saying, no, you deserve equality. in this world. You deserve equality in this country. If you can't get a job, then you start your own business. You start a Black-owned business. If you can't get an education, then you go to the library and you read books. I mean, Malcolm X was mostly self-taught, especially later in his life, and he was so knowledgeable.